Yeah, I want to thank you to carry on this series of seminars have been very, very important in my education, my own education in theoretical neuroscience, which is very recent. Okay, let me share now my slides, and I go to presentation. So you should have the slides there, right? Okay, so this affiliation shows my recent change from solid state physics to neuroscience. And since this talk may be a little bit unusual for some people, let me first make it clear what is in this talk. So I will introduce some basic theoretical neuroscience models that we do in hardware. And I also include some new models. The circuits are of unprecedented simplicity. So that means that if you understand Hodking-Huxley, you'll find all the rest easy. So there's nothing really to know. The important thing aspect is that the circuits are made with very few components, which are widely available and are extremely cheap. So if you have some electronic friends or in a neurobiology lab that they can do electronics, they may be interested in this. The circuits are fully analog, including the spikes and the synaptic currents, so they can be thought of as functions of an eventual analog neurocomputer, which is like a project. Okay, since in my past life, for 30 years, I've been a condensed matter theorist. Let's start with some matter, ordinary matter, cables that you're all familiar with, and you know that a cable is made with a metal core and surrounded by insulating material, and you know that you are safe touching the insulator because it always is insulator. It never changes, and you'll never get electrocuted. So welcome to quantum materials. So these quantum materials called mod materials are pretty surprising because they should be metals if you do the chemistry of that, but they're insulators. So here you have resistivity as a function of temperature of this beautiful single crystal. If you have the material and you lower the temperature, you see that the resistivity increases and increases like in any insulator. But you apply a moderate pressure and you see that something dramatic happens at low temperature. The resistance totally collapses and it becomes a metal. It collapses 10 orders of magnitude, which is huge. So in physics labs, we call this a metal insulator transition. And usually this is driven either by temperature here or by pressure or by other conventional means. But a big surprise came about when these colleagues of mine, Laurent Cariot and Etienne Janot from Nantes, they came and showed me this experiment in this strongly correlated material. They were able to collapse the resistance by electricity. So they apply a strong voltage between the two electrodes of this crystal, and they observe that after a certain time, the resistance dramatically collapsed. Even more surprising was that after a while, the resistance came back to the original value, and they could do this over and over again. So they came to me as a theorist, and I said, Marcelo, can you explain this to me? Can you cook a model? And of course, it's not so hard to cook a model that will collapse the resistance, but we wanted to provide a prediction, a non-trivial prediction that they will check and validate the model. Dealing with these mod insulators is very, very tough theoretically, so we did some phenomenological model that provided this prediction. So the idea was, let's chop this white pulse in small pulses, in short pulses. And then if we have these short pulses, a single pulse is not enough to collapse the resistance. And if the pulses are widely separated, then the resistance will not collapse, nothing will happen because they become independent. But if the time between the pulses is very, very short, you're essentially applying a single white pulse and the resistance has to collapse. And then as a function of this separation, we made a specific prediction, and here for intermediate separation of time, we predicted this, and they verified in the lab this experiment. And that made me very happy because it's very unusual in theoretical condensed matter that you can do a prediction that is validated by the experiment. Usually things go the other way. In any case, the moment the resistance collapses, of course, you have a surge of current through the device. And that was the first aha moment. This is what neurons do, because now I can think of those pulses as the input spikes that enter a neuron through the dendrites. These inputs are accumulated in the body of the cell, in the soma. The potential of the neuron increases, and when it reaches a threshold, as you well know, at the axon hillock, there is the emission of an action potential, and the action potential goes down the axon and is communicated to the downstream neuron. We put this in a solid ground doing systematic studies, and we find out, and we demonstrated that this really behaves like a leaky-integrate-and-fire neuron model. And so we have this paper, which is realized with a bit of this mod insulator, this quantum material, and it made me also very proud to get a patent out of that. As a theoretical physicist, you rarely do that. So I went on working on these mod materials. I joined a collaboration in San Diego, the QMINC, led by Ivan Schuller, and is funded by the DOE, and this has been extremely productive and exciting, and we sort of figure out that this collapse of the resistance is due to filaments, but that would be another topic of a talk. Some of you may be thinking, why do you bother to do this with these materials that are hard to understand and hard to fabricate and hard to everything? You have modern electronics, and in modern electronics, you can fabricate anything. And in fact, it's of course true. And this is an example of an electronic silicon neuron made by the group of Indiveri. But you see that the price to pay is that it's not so simple as a little bit of material that you put in between two electrodes, like in a capacitor, but the dielectric makes all the trick. So I was wondering, is it possible to have the best of both worlds, namely the simplicity of a mod memristor that fabricates a neuron just because of its exotic behavior, but at the same time, the reliability of conventional silicon electronics? And this is the answer to that. So this is a schematic view of a neuron with the input, the soma that integrates the input charge. And this can be represented by an integrate-and-fire model or a leaky-integrate-and-fire model in its most simple manner. So you have an input current. This initially the switch is off, is open, so the capacitor charges. This capacitor represents, of course, the body of the cell, the soma. The voltage between the two electrodes of the capacitor increases, and when it reaches a threshold, the switch closes, and then the capacitor rapidly discharges, generating a spike of current. So this is what this memristor can do, this material can do, as it depends on which is the voltage in between the electrodes. Suddenly, the resistance collapses, and the capacitor discharges. So this is why this is so simple. And then came the second aha moment, because in my previous life, before being a theoretical physicist, I studied electronics in high school. And I remember that there was something that does that kind of thing. And after a quick search in the web, I found the thyristor was exactly what I was looking for. If you look at the IV characteristics of this mod material, you see the insulator to metal transition. And if you compare that to that of the thyristor, which is a conventional electronic component that was invented like in the 50s, you see that they are qualitatively the same. So I said, okay, if they are qualitatively the same, I should be able to fabricate this neuron with conventional components, with this thyristor. And after a little bit of playing around, we find out that this is a smart way to do that. We just have to connect a resistance between the anode and the gate of this thyristor, which has 3 legs, and this provided by the leak. So now we can say we have a leaky-integrate-and-fire. And I argue that this is the simplest, the minimal circuit that you can fabricate to realize this integrate-and-fire model. We have one and only one component for each one of the functions. The leak is the resistance, the integrate is the capacitor, and the trick is done by this thyristor that assures the fire. We put a little bit of a small resistance there, so when the capacitor discharges fast, when it discharges, it generates a little spike of voltage, which is easier to deal with and measure, and this is the V out. So if you wonder how this thyristor looks like, it just cannot be more ordinary than that. It costs literally cents. You can order it online, and you get all the thyristors you want delivered next day at your lab. So this is the circuit, this first circuit that I introduced, which is an analog leaky-integrate-and-fire. Analog because everything is analog here. There is no operation amplifier, there is no digital, there is nothing. Everything is analog. If you go and you look into these traces, you'll see that everything is continuous. So this is a classic leaky-integrate-and-fire behavior. You input pulses. These pulses are integrated, leaky integrated. And when you reach a threshold, then you emit a spike that you measure here. So M is nothing exotic. It's really a real voltage-gated channel, like in the Hodking-Huxley that is familiar to anybody doing theoretical neuroscience. But in this case, we don't need to deal with different ionic currents. We just have simple electrons, and it's enough to charge and discharge this capacitor. So since this is so simple, and it's like this ingredient of a Hodking-Huxley model, there should be no surprise that we can model this as mathematically, just with a single voltage-gated channel. And this is the comparison of experimental traces measured in the lab and what the model can do. So we have a very, very quantitatively reliable model to describe these spikes. So this has been implemented by Damien Depanemaker in Marseille in collaboration with my students. And this is a Python model that is compatible with Brian 2 and can simulate. So we can now simulate in software and fabricate it in hardware, or we can directly simulate in hardware, which is the way I like to see that. Why simulate in hardware? Because it has perfect scaling. If I simulate one neuron during 1 minute, then I want to make the system more complex, and I just put 100 neurons, and I want to simulate during 1 minute, and takes the same minute. We simulate in real time. There are no discretization errors, regardless of the spiking rates. The time represents itself. If we fabricate something, we don't need to demonstrate that it's stable against noise, because if it's working, it's working. We don't need to demonstrate fine-tuning, because if we were able to fabricate it, necessarily we cannot have fine-tuning. And one very attractive feature is that it's ready to deploy. You end up with a circuit that you can just use for many different purposes. Very good. So we moved away from this simple model of a leaky-integrate-and-fire neuron, and we said, okay, how about a bursting neuron model using the same concept of memristive? But since I knew nothing about theoretical neuroscience, I went to the books, and the first thing I read is, okay, to have a bursting, what you need is to have a second time scale, a second dynamical variable with its own intrinsic time. So the simplest way to do it in the circuit that we had before is just to the output resistor, add a capacitor, and this RC is a different time scale compared to the typical time scale of the leaky integrate-and-fire neuron. We fabricated that, and we obtained these different shapes. So we have tonic spiking, we have some fast spiking, and we have two different types of bursting behavior. When I try to learn a bit more about that, we can think of this as a classic model of theoretical neuroscience, which is the two-compartment Pinsky and Brinson model. But to really make comparison was hard because this model has like 19 parameters and it's already a simplification of another model. So to me, it was hopeless. So I did what I do as a theoretical condensed matter physicist. I go and look for the phase diagram. But before showing the phase diagram, one thing which was amusing was when we obtained these traces, I said, do they have anything to do with anything? And you can look online for different traces of bursting biological neurons, and we found this very nice qualitative agreement with this kind of traces, with the spiking, this type of bursting, and then this you go from one to the other on the same neuron by just applying neurotoxins. So, of course, this is a very schematic model, and there is no way to connect these two things. But that's not the end of the story, because as I was saying, just we wanted to know what is the phase diagram of this system, and then we map as a function of the input current and this second time scale here, we found out that there are many different regions in the phase diagram that are associated to the tonic spiking, just as the regular spiking, that at tau equal to 0, you recover a leaky-integrate-and-fire, and then as a function of this scale, you make it slower and slower. You go from tonic to fast, which are different spiking modes, and you find these two bursts. But it was also interesting that once we have this phase diagram, we made contact with another type of experiments. So this is in a pre-Botzinger respiratory neuron, which is also a bursting neuron. And this experiment was very interesting. They just quiet the neuron first by a neurotoxin, and then they only apply current to excite it again. So this is something that we could do. We start with our neuron and we apply current. If we apply current, we move vertically in this phase diagram. So you see that if you start here, you go through this path, which reproduces quite nicely what you see in these experiments. So then I can go back to the experimental traces that we can qualitatively capture, and then you can imagine that what you're doing by using these neurotoxins is you're moving within this phase diagram, evolving and having a path. So perhaps this way of looking at things one day can provide some guidance for neurologists to understand under a different light what is the effect of some neurotoxins, and again, from a model which is totally non-specific. Okay, so far I've been talking only about neurons, but if you want a neural network, you need neurons, and you also need synapses. So we need to fabricate synapses, and this is another minimal circuit model. So this is our leaky-integrate-and-fire neuron that I described. So here we have two neurons, and in between the two neurons, we have a synapse. So this is the presynaptic neuron in red. This is the blue postsynaptic neuron, blue, and they have to be connected, and they are connected by a synapse. And this is the circuit we came up with. And as you see, the circuit is also very, very simple. It's just a capacitor and a resistor. So it's a leaky integration. And these are two identical circuits that are put one after the other. So two blocks, two identical blocks. They are connected by these funny circles. These funny circles is a symbol for a current mirror, which is a totally conventional electronic device. So this is also conventional electronics. You don't need to think much about this current mirror. The only thing that it does is it makes sure that the current that you have here, which is the result of the leaky integration, will be injected into the next stage. And then this, whatever comes out, it will be injected to the next neuron. So this circuit is not capricious. This circuit is really, it is a faithful representation of a conventional textbook model. This is from Wilson textbook, where the first line represents whatever kind of neuron you want. This is a leaky-integrate-and-fire, but you could put others. And then you have the synaptic current. You have a delta function there, and then a leaky integration for one current, and then a second leaky integration will give you the next current. So this is just literally coming from the book. And I will not go through the details. I will just show you by this example. These are measured traces in the circuit. You see the spikes coming out of this leaky-integrate-and-fire neuron. This spike is transformed into a delta function here, where we can regulate the intensity that will be the synaptic efficacy of this synaptic stage. And then you see that after the first leaky integration, a delta becomes an exponential. And then when you leaky integrate the exponential in the second equations, you get an alpha function, which is Ralph's alpha function, which is biomimetic or biorealistic. Is t times exponential of minus t, which is a good dynamical representation of a synaptic current. And the time scales here is just given by simply the product of R times C. And they conserve the current as they should. So this is a quantitative, if you want, representation of that model. Okay, so what can we do with this? So we can build networks. Okay, so we have now a hardware platform, so we should start with the book, chapter by chapter, looking at the simplest motifs that you can imagine to build a base of a platform for these theoretical models. So let me start with the simplest one, which is the self-excitatory. So it's the simplest example of a recursive neuron. So the topology of connecting the synapse onto the neuron itself can be thought of either an intrinsic membrane current, like in the case for excitatory will be an inward calcium current, calcium ionic current, or for the inhibitory, the IKCA, which is a potassium current. And the description of an intrinsic membrane current for the inhibitory case is the same as the slow adaptation in an ADEX or a Ishikevich model. So it's nothing exotic, and it's something that everybody is familiar with. However, you can also think of these synaptic connections as an outapse. So an outapse was considered back in the day an aberration, but now it's known that there are many outapses in the layer 5 of epileptic patients. So this is a physical axon to soma or axon to dendrite self-connection. So in either case, this is what it represents. Okay, so let's start with the simple case of a self-excitatory. So what we do, we start with our circuit. Of course, we don't need one neuron, only keep this one and connect the output back to the input. So this is the circuit. You take the output and you feed back the input into these two stages of a synapse. And then you can excite with a current. Still, you can excite the neuron with a current, which is this I0 here. And then you measure the outcoming spikes here, and you can measure the synaptic current, the self-synaptic current as coming into the neuron. So the neuron is now fed by an external current and a self-generated excitatory current. So I'll show you that with this, we can make a dynamical memory or an excitation bump with just one neuron. So first, disconnect the feedback. So when you disconnect the feedback, you input with some incoming current I0, and you have spikes. And you increase I0, you have faster and faster spikes. Those spikes generate synaptic currents. If the spikes are very separated, you have spike by spike mode, and then you have these spikes of synaptic current. But if the interval between the spikes becomes comparable to the time constant of your synapse, then you start integrating them, and what you get at the end of the day is that this frequency will generate a synaptic current, which is proportional to the frequency, just the cumulative effect of these spikes. So the activation curve of the neuron, this is now measured. This is what we fabricate. You have the current, you have the frequency, and you see the typical behavior of a leaky-integrate-and-fire with a threshold. And it's interesting to see that our neurons come, I didn't expect that, but this is how it works. They have a depolarization block effect. So that's also quite interesting. I'll be happy to talk more about that. In any case, the synaptic current is represented by a linear relationship. This is also measured. Depending on the spike in frequency, that spike in frequency will generate an output of synaptic current that we want to feedback that. So we close the feedback, and so we close the feedback, and what we are left is with a self-consistent condition. Why? Because the frequency of the neuron depends on the total input current, and the total input current depends on the subthreshold current plus the self-excitatory current. So the self-excitatory current, as I described, depends on the frequency. So now if you put the feedback, you want that the frequency of the neuron that depends on the total current, and the total current depends on what is the frequency. So these two frequencies have to be self-consistent. You can do that geometrically if you have this self-excitatory current, and now if it's self-excitatory, you have to add the subthreshold current. So it's a subthreshold current here. And then you have this construction, and the crossing of these two lines will give you what is this self-consistent current. But of course, if I0 is subthreshold, F star equal to 0 is also a solution, which is there. So if you have a subthreshold, there is no frequency. And if there is no frequency, this is 0. So this is the I0, and this is 0, and that's a solution. So we have two solutions. So we have bistability. So we should be able to fabricate a dynamical memory or a working memory, which is just a single spiking neuron. This is shown here. This is now traces measured in our small circuit with a subthreshold I0 that generates no spikes, so the frequency is 0. Then we perturb the system with a delta pulse. This delta pulse generates activity. The activity generates the self-excitatory current. This self-excitatory current is added to the I0, so the frequency goes up, the rate goes up, and then when I stop it, the system remains in a stable state. So this is the dynamical memory, or the bistability. You have no spikes here with I0, and you have a spiking state with that. And then to switch it off, you apply a negative perturbation during sufficient time, and then you kill the self-excitatory current, and the system comes back to the side. So it is important to see that this is stable. So this is also product of the experiment. We have this dynamical memory state, the spiking self-consistent state. We come with a perturbation, which is now relatively short, like half a second or so, and the system increases the rate, but then comes back to the state. If the perturbation is negative, we can suppress the spikes, but if we do that during short time, it's not enough to totally kill it, and it comes back, and you can check that the system is perturbed, but goes back to the attractor. You can also check the self-consistent, the stability in this plot, where you see the activity of the neuron, and this is the synaptic current, and you see that you have two crossings. So you have one that is unstable and another that is stable. It's not hard to convince yourself that if you perturb the system and you go here, this frequency brings you back here. So this is now the self-generated current, which corresponds to a smaller frequency. And then this frequency will lower the self-excitatory current, and you flow back to this stable point. it is interesting to see that if you just take that is the product of a concavity, if you were used, if for the neuron you adopt a ReLU, for instance, which is linear instead of having this concavity, you will only have this unstable runaway crossing. So that would not realize this dynamical memory. And as I mentioned, that these models are really not different from the adaptive exponential for the inhibitory case. For the excitatory case, we call it XX, and you can just realize this dynamical memory with a single neuron. This is done by Damian de Maker, just running a regular ADEX where you just change one sign in the first equation to change from adaptation to self-excitation, and you see that you recover this. So one may say, well, but is a dynamical memory with a single neuron realistic? And that it may be questionable. But then I want to point out a very beautiful development in neuroscience, which I have to thank David Kleinfeld for pointing this out when I was visiting San Diego a few years ago, that there was a talk on this and got totally mesmerized by that, and I still want to keep on working on that, is the attractor model of the head direction of the Drosophila, which is also called the neural compass. And it's not a surprise that it's a ring attractor, because that was already predicted with many neurons and a complex connectivity that generates the bump and so on. But the real surprise is that it's made by a handful of neurons. I refer to this recent article in Nature, where they have obtained, of course, the connectome, and they show that the connectome is made of very few neurons. So they pose the question, how can you achieve this function with so few neurons? So this is the optogenetic image of the ellipsoidal body with the activity, with the bump of activity of the Drosophila. And if you compare this to that, and you split it in 8, you see that really the activity seems to be happening on a single neuron. So it may be interesting. In any case, so another thing that we could do with this dynamical memory is to revisit another classic problem of theoretical neuroscience, which is greater persistent activity. So this is the beautiful data published on greater persistent activity, where you see that you can have a persistent activity, and after pulses, you can increase, after each pulse, you can increase in steps the activity rate of a neuron. And then if you put negative pulses, you can decrease it also in steps. So of course, how do you this is a continuous attractor, and how do you get sure that this is stable, but it can be continuously modulated at the same time? So there are several works on this thing. I like to point out here the work of Kulakov and collaborators, where they pointed out the importance of the stability that is necessary for a dynamical memory. But in their model, they said it's required to have a population and a population distribution with many different values, and then the system recruits different numbers of neurons and so on to capture this. Now, if we go back to our simple dynamical neuron, we see that we can tune this dynamical memory or this dynamical attractor by just changing the efficacy of the self-synaptic conductance. So we can do that very simply in our model by tuning that value of the resistance of this efficacy that I mentioned before. And these are data that we obtain with our single neuron, which very beautifully reproduces this data there. So you can do greater persistent activity with just a single neuron, which may be very interesting for robotics or other applications. Very well. So now I go to the self-inhibitory. So the self-inhibitory is, like I said, very similar qualitative to what would be an adaptive exponential or the Ishikevich model, where this is the slow adaptive current. And of course, you can get a pacemaker. If you over-adapt, then the adaptation totally kills the spiking, and then that kills the self-inhibitory current, and then the spiking is recovered, and so on. So you can also do that with a geometrical description, but the only thing that I want to point out is that in adaptive exponential and in Ishikevich, you really have only one stage, which is one leaky integration. You have only one differential equation. Here we put two to have an alpha, which is more physically realistic, and then what you do, if you go to the equations and you see that now you have two stages, then you end up that for the self-inhibitory current, you can obtain the equation of a driven harmonic oscillator with friction. Here you see how this behaves really like harmonic oscillator. So then it is interesting to think if this may be the neural correlate of limbic motion of all animals that really behave like pendulums and are described in these classic works. Okay, so now I move on to real start building networks. So now I put two of these neurons with self-inhibition, and if I connect them by mutual inhibition, I obtain a central pattern generator. So this is also a classic model of neuroscience. This is the heartbeat of the leech and the measurements, and you see how it looks. So we have two adaptive neurons disconnected when they are in tonic spiking, and the moment we connect the mutual inhibition, we have now the phenomenon of escape and release, and you see that the activity of one is really overlapping the activity of the other, and you see that the frequency goes up and down very much in very nice qualitative agreement to what you see there. And we have investigated other types of CPG, like that for the stomachogastron ganglia and other CPGs as well. So let me show you a little bit of the flavor of how we do this. So we started designing our circuits with some electronic engineering hardware. You see that the circuits are very small. Then we go to fabricate them, and when we get them working in the breadboard, and you see that the simulations capture well what we can measure, and then we want to clean this up, we can make PCBs that look like this. And I want to emphasize that this is the first version that we have of PCBs. We have not tried to optimize them, but these are like really Lego blocks, because this is the neuron, this is the other neuron. They're very small, can be made smaller. And these are the synapses that, of course, can also be made smaller. But the point that I want to emphasize, these are Lego blocks. This is only one design, this is another design, and we can interconnect all of them. And just by changing what are the values of the resistance, we can tune the values of the parameters of the model. And I want to show here that we can really match biological times. Here you have seconds, so we can really do this at any time, because since we are not miniaturizing these things, the capacitors can be big enough so to make it biocompatible. Very well. So my time is up, so I want to close with the conclusions. So I introduce a neuromorphic electronic platform to build theoretical spiky neural network models in Howard. I think this is of unprecedented simplicity. Even a theorist like me could understand it and explain it. It's ultra low cost, because this is all basic electronics, which is widely available and can be reproduced very easily. In our last paper, we put a GitHub where we put all the PCBs and the list of materials that you need to, if you want to fabricate this. We have implemented basic primitives like dynamical memory, GPA, adaptation, bursting CPGs, etc. And we are ready now to start exploring more complex motifs and learn how to combine them to search for cognitive functions emerging from the dynamics. And in particular, I want to fabricate this head direction system of Drosophila, which is so fascinating. And nature says that it can be done with few neurons, so that should be doable. So that's something we're currently working on now. So from a more global perspective, I think this can be thought of a low-dimensional bottom-up approach to neural networks. And this is unlike the top-down large black boxes of AI. So here, neuron circuits can also be viewed as neural masses, and that may allow for coarse-grained modeling, like for instance in the epileptor. So this methodology, I think, is well suited to implement theoretical modeling, as I was trying to argue, and I described an example, brain-machine interfaces. So we are starting a very exciting project with Herman Zumbre of the École Normale in trying to connect the zebrafish larva that he studies with optogenetics with the electronic neurons, and we are planning also, we are implementing now STDP, so that will allow to have plasticity in our neural networks, and it will be very exciting to see how these two neural networks may interact, an artificial one with a biological one. So this is also well suited for medical devices like Parkinson or epilepsy simulator, for neuroprosthetics, robotics, control, and as I mentioned before, for the case of the head direction system for autonomous navigation systems. So my time is up, and I thank you very much for the attention. And just to close, I would like to show one more thing, which is everybody in the audience with a physics background knows who Richard Feynman was. He was one of the greatest theoretical physicists in the past century. But maybe many people do not know that he was not only at the base of quantum computers, the concept of quantum computer, but he was very close with Carver Mead and John Hopfield, teaching a course in Caltech in the 80s on the physics of computation. So he was very close to people that are central to the field and to this talk that I gave. So this is the blackboard that they found when he passed away, so they put it under glass to preserve it. But in this blackboard, where there were many notations of Feynman, I was very drawn to this one, which reads, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So coming from a theorist, when I saw this, I got myself very much, I felt it resonated very much with the way I was thinking about this endeavor that I'm starting now in theoretical neuroscience. And with this, I want to thank everybody.